Welcome, wanderer of the small hours, to a tale that Gotham herself has kept folded in her darkest pocket, stitched with thread that gleams only under the moon's interrogation. Tonight, I offer you not comfort, but a forbidden truth, story older than the neon, deeper than the sewers, stranger than the masks we think we know. If you have come seeking the lullaby of easy answers, turn back now. But if you would hear the city's confession, spoken in the voice of rain and stone and Mercury bright laughter, then settle into the shadows with me. Before we descend together, I ask one small thing. If this tale finds its mark in your marrow, if it troubles your sleep in the most exquisite way, then mark this moment with your approval. Let the algorithm know that some stories deserve to be whispered in more ears. And now, let your breathing slow. Let your limbs grow heavy as iron bells. For we are going deep below the streets, below the years, below the very lie that cities tell about themselves. Close your eyes if you wish. The darkness will wait. In a rain-washed midnight, when the city's pulse drums low and patient as a sleeper's heart, an unassuming archivist descended into the shuttered sub-basements of the Gotham Historical Society. He was a man of no particular consequence, wire spectacles, balanced on a thin nose, coat sleeves worn pale at the cuffs, the sort of scholar who lived more comfortably among ledgers than among the living. Yet on this night, consequence came looking for him in the form of a draft subtle as a sigh that smelled of copper and old paper and something older still, something that had no proper name in the modern lexicon. He followed that breath through corridors where dust hung like powdered time past shelves burdened with the city's sleeping memories, until he stood before a locked iron door that bore no placard, no index entry, no acknowledgement of its existence in any catalog he had ever consulted. The lock yielded to his persistence, for such doors always do. When the hour is right, and the seeker sufficiently alonened, the vault beyond exhaled a humidity that spoke of earth and depth and things preserved beyond their natural span. His candle, a small and mortal flame, painted trembling gold across walls lined with archive boxes labeled in a clerk's copperplate hand. Asterisk founding documents, restricted. Asterisk the archivist's pulse, quickened with that particular species of hunger known only to those who traffic in secrets. And he drew forth a folio of brittle maps and diaries, their pages the color of old bone, dated in a flowing script. Asterisk, Anno Domini, 1635. Asterisk. The mood that had been studious calm began its subtle migration toward something else, a hushed dread, as if the city itself had leaned closer to listen, pressing its vast and patient ear against the ceiling of that forgotten room. For within those pages gleamed the first secret, the seed from which all the rest would grow. Gotham's founders were not simply merchants and magistrates, not merely ambitious men with charters and surveyors' chains. They were initiates in an alchemical fraternity, a circle of seekers led by one Mercurius Arkham, whose letters spoke in the ornate language of the Hermetic arts. Their ambition, recorded in careful ink, now brown as dried blood, was nothing less than the transmutation of a city's salt, distill virtue from vice, to coax the city's shadow into a vessel where it might be studied, contained, perhaps even purified. The archivist's fingers trembled as he unrolled a charcoal rubbing, large as a tablecloth, depicting a circular stone cistern sunk deep in marshland. Beside it, in Occam's own hand, coordinates and observations. Asterisk the spring rises here, where the land remembers older waters. Compasses spin, birds fall silent. the boundary grows thin. Asterisk, and beneath that, in smaller script, almost apologetic, asterisk, we have begun the excavation. God and the elements willing, we shall have our vessel by midwinter. Asterisk, the archivist's breath caught. He knew that marshland, every child of Gotham knew it, though none called it by its ancient name anymore. It was the industrial flats where Ace Chemicals now stood, its towers exhaling vapor into the indifferent sky, its vats processing compounds whose names were strings of syllables without poetry. His candle sputtered in an inexplicable draught, though no window pierced these depths, and the question rose in his mind like mist from dark water, simple and terrible. How could a vat exist 2 centuries before the factory that held it? The archivist read onward, because men of his temperament cannot stop once the thread is in their fingers. And the narrative advanced through those brittle pages like a procession of monks carrying an unspeakable relic. The diaries described what Mercurius Arkham had named asterisk, a spring of Mercurius incipiens, asterisk, fool s, Mercury, a term the archivist recognized from the shadowy byways of alchemical literature, though never in connection with anything so terrestrial as a city's foundation. The surveyor's reports grew strange as they neared the spring. Compasses spun lazily, tracing circles rather than pointing true. Horses balked and had to be coaxed forward with blinders and soft words. Birds fell silent in the trees, or fell altogether, their small bodies found at the marsh's edge with no mark of injury, only a peculiar expression in their glassy eyes' bemusement, if such a word could be applied to creatures of instinct. One surveyor, a Dutchman named Van Horn, wrote in his own tongue, translated in a marginal note by some later scholar, that the water softens the border between rule and riot, makes the mind feel as though it stands in 2 rooms at once, one orderly and one laughing. He did not return for the 2nd week of work. His tools were found, arranged in a perfect spiral, on the muddy bank. The chapter's mood, which had begun with scholarly fascination, turned now to mounting awe, for the ritual language that filled the subsequent pages was no metaphor. Arkham and his circle had quarried stone from the inland hills, white limestone veined with quartz, and shaped it into a cistern 15 feet across and twice the depth of a man's height. They lined its base with lead and silver in alternating bands, inscribed with figures the archivist could not parse, not quite astrological, not quite geometric, something that made the eye slide away as if the angles refused to hold still. The lore unveiled itself like a flower built of shadow. The founders meant to siphon Gotham's latent chaos, that mercurial quality that made men dream of fortunes and murders in equal measure, into this contained medium, the Dionysian Protocol. They named it after the god who laughed at boundaries and made wine from water and madness from sobriety. If the chaos could be drawn into the stone bowl, they reasoned, then the city above might be pleasant as a hymn, orderly as a regiment, profitable as a well-tended vine. But the liquid did not tame the city. Rather, as years became decades and decades threatened to become a century, the city poured more of itself into the liquid. The cistern breathed. It drank from the streets above, through channels the founders had cut small gutters, decorative drains in courthouse squares, the roots of funeral processions that always seemed to bend, inexplicably, toward the marsh. And what the cistern gathered, it remembered. As the archivist traced one of the sigils, etched into the margin, with his fingertip an act of idle curiosity, nothing more, he noticed. with a lurch of his pulse, that the ink there was still damp, impossibly damp after centuries sealed in darkness. And the hook took shape in his mind, sharp and bright as a fishhook through the tongue. Who first fell into that stone bowl? And why was there laughter described where screams should be? He turned the pages with a curator's care, though his hands were no longer quite steady, and followed a trail of annotations, some in Occam's hand, others in scripts that belonged to later generations. A chorus of record keepers who had inherited the secret and tended it in silence. The archivist overlaid maps across centuries, tracing property lines and industrial surveys, and the key event clicked into place with the inevitability of tumblers in a lock. Ace Chemicals sat directly atop the original cistern, its famous vat, that great steel drum where so many of the city's legends claimed their transformations, was no innovation of modern industry. It was a shell, a modern disguise for an older mouth. Somewhere beneath the concrete and rebar, the stone bowl still rested in its bed of clay and forgotten offerings, and the factory's filtration systems fed it as faithfully as the founder's channels ever had. The emotional tone shifted in the archivist's chest, no longer the methodical deduction of scholarship, but a prickling sense of orchestration, as though the city itself had arranged its own costume, dressing ancient rite in the garb of smokestacks and time clocks. Gotham had a genius for continuity beneath the churn of progress, a way of keeping its old appointments, even as it tore down and rebuilt its skin. The lore widened as he discovered a ledger of tithes, its columns marching down pages with the discipline of soldiers. Wealthy families had funded the protocol in secret across generations, their names appearing like leitmotifs in an opera whose audience had long since filed out. Arkham, naturally, Cobblepot, with their shipping interests and waterfront holdings. Elliot, physicians and landlords. And Wayno. The Waynes appeared early and often, their contributions measured not merely in coin, but in favors, in properties donated, in civic projects steered with invisible hands toward the marsh's slow hunger. Each family paid to keep the experiment hidden and vigorous. Each understood, or was made to understand by fathers who had learned from their own fathers, that the city's stability depended on this peculiar drainage, this secret plumbing of the soul. A grainy daguerreotype slipped from between two pages, its surface crazed with age. It showed men in frock coats and tall hats standing by a stone lip wreathed in fog, and there was no factory in the frame, no tower or tank, only the marsh and the low sky and the cistern's dark aperture. The archivist brought his candle close. One figure at the image's edge had a blurred, almost grinning face, not blurred by motion, he thought, but by something intrinsic, as though the camera had refused to fix those features fully into the realm of the permanent. And the hook, like a footfall on a stair, somewhere above him in the sleeping society, whispered its question into the silence. What bargain did the founders make with the thing that gathers in the dark water? The timeline bent then, and the archivist found himself reading not history, but prelude, and the pages turned toward a night he thought he knew, a night that belonged to the city's popular mythology, the night a struggling comedian, masked as the Red Hood, was persuaded into one clumsy heist that would become his epitaph. But here, the narrative progressed by revealing the heist as more than desperation or bad luck. It was a lure dreamt into him through the city's secret architecture. The comedian and the archivist had no name for him, only the absence where a name should be. A blankness that felt intentional, had been receiving omens for months, though he mistook them for coincidence or his own failing nerves. Jokes that misfired in patterns too consistent to be chance. A deck of cards purchased for a bit he was writing that proved to be missing all its kings. A child's wind-up clown found on his doorstep one gray morning, its key turned to the end so that it sat frozen in mid-gesture, metallic grin, wide and unrepentant. The city spoke in symbols to those whose souls leaned toward the cistern's frequency, and the comedian's soul, hollowed out by ridicule and poverty and the weight of a wife's hopeful eyes, was precisely tuned. The protocol required not merely a vessel, but a willing vessel, someone who had already begun the work of dissolving himself, who stood so close to the edge of meaning that one more step would be indistinguishable from flight. The mood in those pages glided from grim resignation to a terrible, fated calm. The comedian sensed, without words, that the vat was not a hazard to avoid, but a calling to answer. He put on the Red Hood's ridiculous helmet, bright as a stoplight, round as a zero, and let himself be led by men whose faces he would not remember, through a chemical plant whose corridors seemed to know his footsteps. Batman's silhouette appeared in the steam and hard light, a stern black sigil, and the city held its breath, not in fear, the archivist realized, but in anticipation, the way a theater holds its breath before the soprano reaches for the impossible note. The comedian stumbled, reached for a railing that was not where his hand expected, and his body arced toward the VAT's surface like a coin tossed to an old wish, a sacrifice fed to waters that had been waiting with the patience that only cities and stones possess. And the hook glistened in the archivist's mind. If this was no accident, what waited in the liquid to meet him halfway? He did not burn. That was the first truth that announced itself as his body breached the surface and the world inverted. He did not burn, did not dissolve in the manner of flesh meeting caustic chemistry. Instead, he came apart like paper in rain, each fiber of memory floating free, untethered from the spine of self that had held them in their common shape. The story advanced into an inner sea, vast and dark and patient. He saw the thing he was becoming through an eye that was not his own, an eye that had watched the city from below for longer than the city had possessed its name. Centuries scrolled past, each decade a different quality of light filtering down through the liquid, and he understood with a glacial panoramic wonder that he was seeing through the city's submerged consciousness, its dreaming mind. The lore revealed itself not in words, but in a kind of osmotic knowing. Fool's Mercury was not merely chemical, it was mnemonic, a reservoir that held not atoms but contradictions, not molecules, but the city's collected hungers and suppressions. The cistern was a lung that breathed what the streets exhaled, every unspoken rage, every swallowed laugh, every moment of decorum that concealed a howl. And those who had touched the liquid, whether by design or accident across the centuries, left fingerprints of thought in its depths. He read them all at once. A fisherman who had fallen through thin ice in the marsh 2 centuries prior, and surfaced changed, speaking only in riddles until he wandered into the forest and was seen no more. A maid who had stolen a vial of the stuff for her mistress's rival and tasted it herself, spending her last days painting her face white and dancing in the market square until her heart gave out from joy. Fragments of 100 partial transformations, none given the full immersion, the complete baptism. And there, at the limen, where the self he had been met, the self he would become, a presence coalesced. It was no god, yet godlike in its patience. It bore no face, yet seemed to look at him with something older than eyes. It addressed him not in syllables, but in the timbre of distant carnival organs, a music that made the bones remember dancing. The hook rippled outward through the liquid. Why him? And what shape must he take to carry what the city has hoarded? The present spoke without syllables, and the plot strode forward with the weight of revelation. It confessed the founder's intent in a language that bypassed his ears entirely, settling directly into the meat of his understanding, to drain Gotham's riot into a chalice, to consecrate the streets to law. An act of gilded hubris whose side effect and predicted, though perhaps not unpredictable, was to distill chaos into a sharper, purer spirit. The founders believed they were sanitizing their city, pruning away its wildness. What they created instead was a vintage, aged in stone, that grew more potent with every passing year. The mood moved through the comedian's dissolving mind from dread to a paradoxical serenity, for the truth felt inevitable, like tide and moon, like the way shadows grow long when the sun remembers its descent. Lore bloomed in careful petals. Each rite the founders completed along the waterfront teach cornerstone, laid with a hidden charm. Each parade route carved to channel the crowd's emotion toward the marsh, every courthouse aisle aligned, according to principles borrowed from cathedral architects and grimoire diagrams. All of it fed the cistern. The city was a vast instrument, its streets, strings, its buildings, frets, and the music it played drained steadily into the stone bowl until it held a city's worth of unspoken laughter and thwarted appetite. The presence told him that vessels had been tried before. Pale men touched by diluted draughts, given sips rather than drownings, and they had cracked under the pressure. Their minds broke like cheap pottery, unable to hold the contradictions. The liquid needed not a strong vessel, but flexible asterisk, one a soul, already hollowed by ridicule, by failure, by the particular species of humiliation that comes from standing before an audience and hearing only the cough, the shuffled foot, the cruel silence that follows a joke's death. Only such a soul could contain the pressure without bursting. Only someone who had already learned to laugh at the abyss could become its mouthpiece. The hook gleamed like a coin on a riverbed. What bargain must he accept to become the city's living spout? Rising within the liquid, like a seed in loam, suspended in the mercurial dark, he was shown the city as a design knot, the city of bricks and glass that he had walked as a nameless comedian, but the city as asterisk blueprint, asterisk as occult geometry, as a machine built to specifications he could now read as easily as a child reads his own name. Streets were not mere pragmatic paths from point to point. They were lines of force, laid down according to angles that encouraged certain thoughts and discouraged others. The grand avenues that radiated from the central squares were not Renaissance whimsy, but channels, directing the flow of crowds and carriages, and, more subtly, the flow of collective feeling toward the cistern's hidden mouth. Gargoyles perched on cornices were not ornament, they were watchstones, their grotesque faces calibrated to angles borrowed from older traditions, their empty eyes aligned with solstice, sun, and equinox moon, holding the structure taut. Train tracks cut the city into sections, their iron forming sigils that only a bird or a map reader might perceive. Pentagrams and hexagrams drawn at the scale of miles, binding and channeling. The narrative progressed as he learned to read the plan, and the mood shifted from awed student to delighted heretic, savoring the audacity of a city built as a wheel of containment, a spell written in zoning laws and civic pride, lore unfurled in layers. Wayne Tower crowned the axis opposite the cistern, not by chance, but by ancient design, where the cistern pulled downward, draining chaos into its depths. The tower rose upward, an aspiration made stone and steel, a declaration of order's supremacy. It was the axis mundi, inverted heaven and hellbound in civic partnership. Arkham Asylum nailed the circle's southern arc, and now he understood its true purpose. It was not merely a hospital for the mad, but a reservoir's overflow valve, a place where the city sent those who had touched the chaos too directly and needed to be quarantined from the circuit lest they flood the system. Crime Alley, narrow and perpetually shadowed, its bricks stained with more than rain lay at the interstice where pity and rage met, where the city's compassion and its cruelty braided together into a single cord. It was a generator point, a place of transformation, and now he understood it was no accident that pearls had once spilled there, white and rolling portents of a different vessel being prepared. Even the public parks served the design. Their fountains and reflecting pools were tuned, their placements calculated. In summer twilight, when the city's heat reached its fever pitch, those waters set the blood humming at a frequency that fed the cistern, that kept the wheel turning. He understood his role now. He was not to ruin the circle. How could he woven into it as he was, but to keep it spinning? False order that congealed into tyranny, was the true enemy of the protocol. The city required motion, the dance of order and chaos, not the victory of one over the other. The hook shivered through him like a plucked wire. If chaos is an appointed office, who was appointed to embody its rival?
The current quickened. The liquid, which had held him suspended in timeless communion, began to pulse with a different rhythm, and faces rose from the mercury like figures surfacing in a slow-developing photograph. Jesters without stages, pale figures at plague carts, wearing grins while others wore anguish. A laughing saboteur with glove-white hands, moving through a soot-thick decade, leaving factory wheels broken and foremen's ledgers painted with obscene limericks. The story moved forward by stitching a lineage, and the mood leaned from loneliness, for he had thought himself singular in this drowning, toward an uncanny kinship. He recognized them, these pale shadows, as a man might recognize cousins he has never met but whose features echo his own. Lore named them in the margins of his understanding. LeBlanc, who danced through the city's streets in the 1790s, when revolution fever crossed the ocean, and the founders' children wondered if their protocol would hold. He wore powder and rouge and spoke in verses that made magistrates question their own judgments. He was given a diluted draft. The cistern was still being calibrated, the dosage uncertain, and he burned bright for 3 years before his mind cracked, and he walked into the harbor, laughing, and did not surface. The carnival ghost of the 1860s, who appeared during the draft riots when the city tore at its own throat. No one knew his name. He wore a patchwork coat and moved through the burning streets, rearranging the chaos into patterns that prevented total collapse, that kept the riot from becoming annihilation. He was fed by sips, by teaspoons smuggled from the cistern by nervous custodians of the protocol, and he faded when the riot ebbed, his body found in an alley with a smile frozen on his colorless face. The smiler of the speakeasies, who moved through the 20s turning raids into carnivals, and making corrupt police captains laugh so hard at their own absurdity that some resigned their posts in fits of clarity. He took his draft from a hip flask, refilled weekly, and he lasted nearly a decade before the stock market crashed and the city's mood turned too dark even for him. They found him in a bathtub, the flask empty beside him, his face painted in colors that had run with his tears. Each was a partial echo, each touched by diluted drafts, given only fractions of the cistern's heart. Each surfaced when the city choked on too much rule, when order threatened to petrify into oppression, and each was snuffed when their minds cracked, for the partial dose made them fragile, or when their era shifted and the city no longer needed quite that shape of laughter. But he, the comedian who had fallen, not in sips, but in total immersion, was tendered the cistern's heart, the pure distillate. His life's comedy had cored him into a cup that could flex without breaking. His failures had been a kind of training, teaching him to bend rather than shatter under humiliation's weight. The hook came grinning through the liquid. If the city completes its Jester at last, what of the knight whose armor gleams on the opposite arc?
The vision tilted, and he was shown chambers of limestone and bat-breathed air, though his body remained suspended in Mercury. The protocol's architecture had always been dual. He understood now, not one vessel but two, not one office but a pair of thrones, facing each other across the city's wheel. The plot advanced through the other half of the equation. The Wayne line had been kept in orbit, held close to the city's axis through centuries of careful coincidence. Philanthropy and tragedy were measured out in equal portions, generation after generation. Fortunes made and lost and made again, ensuring the family remained powerful but never comfortable, never so secure that they might leave. Deaths timed to cultivate the proper character loss, administered as a sculptor's tool, chipping away complacency, carving edges, until a child stood in an alley between the spilled pearls and the spreading blood. And something in the city's hidden machinery engaged with a sound like a key turning in a lock no one had known existed. The mood traveled through the comedian's expanding consciousness, from revelation to a reluctant, mirthful sympathy. He recognized in that distant child now a man who dressed as judgment itself, fellow prisoner of the circle. Someone else pressed into a shape not wholly their own choosing. The lore was stark and beautiful in its economy. The cave beneath Wayne Manor was a natural node, an inversion of the cistern's bowl. Where the stone bowl held the city's liquid chaos, the limestone cave held its crystallized fury, its stalactites formed from the slow drip of rage at injustice. It was the negative space, the antimatter to the cistern's matter. And the bat that haunted it was not a whim of a traumatized psyche, but a herald that rose from the earth's own vocabulary, a creature of the between places, hunter of the dark symbol of order emerging from the void. The founders did not foresee the exact mask. They could not have predicted leather and Kevlar, utility belts and grappling hooks. But they prepared the vacancy, the asterisk, need asterisk, for such a figure. Through their careful calibration of the city's tensions, they made a throne and left it empty, trusting that eventually someone would be shaped to fill it. The comedian, though, that word no longer fit him, for he was becoming something both more and less than a man, sensed with the calm of accepted arithmetic that his first steps upon rebirth must be toward that shadow. The circuit would not close, the wheel would not turn properly, until Jester and Knight acknowledged each other, until chaos and order met and began their eternal, necessary dance. The hook lowered like a visor. When he rises, will the Knight remember his part in the dance?
He breached the surface like an idea taking breath. The narrative strode into the waking city as his new eyes opened, eyes that had forgotten how to weep but remembered something older than tears, something that lived at the root of all comedy and found the world laced with runes only he could read. Stoplights blinked in ternary rhythms that corresponded to formulae from Arkham's journals. patterns designed to keep the city's pulse at a specific tempo. Alleyways bent like commas, pausing the flow of pedestrians for half-seconds that fed back into the hidden architecture. Crowds parted before him in choreography no one had taught them, their bodies responding to a frequency he now broadcast simply by existing. The mood shifted from newborn wonder to a sovereign ease. His laughter, and he laughed often now, not because things were funny, but because laughter was his new mode of speech, his native tongue, was a tuning fork that made the masonry sing. Windows rattled in their frames when he passed. Dogs raised their heads in yards and regarded him with the puzzled respect they reserved for thunderstorms. The lore clarified with each step. His mirth was not madness, or not madness alone. It was resonance, a frequency perfectly calibrated to trouble stagnant pools of order and draw out what Gotham hid under its tongue. A glance could tilt a man's fate toward impulse or mercy, according to what the city needed in that moment to keep its wheel true. He was a physician of sorts, administering chaos in medicinal doses, preventing the tyranny of too much law. His skin had bleached in the cistern, not from chemicals, but from the leaching away of pretense, the stripping of all the colors that society applies to make men palatable to each other. And his face. His face had fixed itself in the expression that the comedian had always worn inside, the smile that hid behind the smile, the one that knew the punchline to the joke the world was too polite to tell. He set his steps toward the oldest rooftop where gargoyles kept counsel, stone guardians that had watched the city longer than any living thing. He knew who must meet him under their chipped wings. The protocol demanded it. The circle required it. And somewhere in the part of him that remembered being a man, he wanted it, wanted to see if the night would recognize what the comedian had become, wanted to know if order would acknowledge its compliment. The hook shone like rain on slate. Will the night hear the music he has always fought by? They met where the wind was high, and the city thrummed beneath them like a generator spinning at the threshold of hearing. The rooftop was one of the old ones, built before the war that changed which war one meant when saying the war. Its edges lined with gargoyles whose features had been simplified by a century of weather. The story moved through their first renewed clash. For the night had been hunting him, of course, tracking the strange ripples his presence made in the city's patterns. And it was less a fight than a ritual, more a sacrament than a skirmish. Baton and blade, cape and coat, each garment catching the wind, each a heraldic banner declaring allegiance to a different principle. Blows rang out in the iron bones of bridges far below and echoed from the quiet stones of courthouse courtyards, carrying farther than physics alone could account for, as if the city's architecture amplified their exchange. The mood turned from ferocity to something else, something grave and mutual. They moved with the fluency of partners, in a dance neither had formally learned, each anticipating the other's strike and counterstrike, and beneath the violence a comprehension grew, subtle as dawn, undeniable as tide. They were completing a shape that had waited incomplete for centuries. The lore deepened with each exchanged blow. Their encounters were valves the founders never wrote down, spontaneous sacraments that occurred when the protocol required adjustment. Too much order, and the city calcified, became brittle, vulnerable to the shattering that comes when pressure exceeds tolerance. Too much chaos, and the city dissolved, became lawless in ways that fed not liberation, but predation. So they fought, and in fighting performed a kind of regulation, a bleeding of pressure that kept the wheel turning at the proper speed. The gargoyles turned their chipped faces as if to mark the moment, and bats wheeled overhead, the living echoes of the cave's chosen symbol, and somewhere in the factory district a shift-change whistle blew. And all of it was part of the pattern, all of it woven into the unseen machinery. He spoke at last, his voice still learning its new registers, still finding the melody that lived between laughter and lamentation. Do you know what you are, my dark and beautiful opposite? Do you know what we are together? The night said nothing, but the silence was an answer, a tolling bell. an acknowledgement that rang in the space between them. "Neither of us can quit," he continued, offering the awful kindness of truth, "without breaking what we both love and what we both despise. You are the city's fist, and I am its laughter. You are the law that prevents annihilation, and I am the chaos that prevents tyranny. We are the wheel's two halves, forever turning, forever pushing against each other to keep the motion alive." The knight's cowl concealed his expression, but the set of his shoulders, the infinitesimal shift in his stance, spoke of understanding reluctantly received, truth accepted but not celebrated. The Hook stood waiting in the hush after the storm, when both combatants paused to catch breath that came too hard. If the dance is endless, who writes the steps we do not see?
We return, now must return, for all tales know their shape, and this one is a circle to the subterranean vault, where the archivist's pen scratches the tale toward its close. His candle has burned low. His hand aches from hours of transcription, copying from the folio that should not exist, recording a history that contradicts itself at every turn, unraveling and resolving in the same motion. But as he writes the final passages, as he describes the rooftop meeting and the night's silent acknowledgement and the wheel that will turn forever in Gotham's hidden workings, something changes in his handwriting. The narrative culminates by unmasking the storyteller as the subject. The ink wanders into arabesques, margins sprout diamonds and jests, small grinning faces sketched with the confidence of a practiced hand. The handwriting blooms, curves, becomes not the cramped script of a timid archivist, but something wider, looser, barely contained by the page's edge. The mood slides from tidy completion to vertigotha pleasant kind, the kind that turns the world into a deck of cards waiting to be cut, waiting to be shuffled into new configurations. The archivist, if he was ever truly an archivist, sets down his pen and regards his own hand with an expression somewhere between surprise and recognition, as if reintroducing himself to an old acquaintance whose face he had forgotten. The lore resolves and unravels at once. In a city made malleable by alchemy, where stone cisterns hold memory and buildings enforce geometry that reaches into the soul, the telling is part of the spell. Stories shape belief, and belief in Gotham is a solvent as strong as any Mercury, eating through the barrier between what is and what might be. The Joker, no longer merely a man, no longer bound wholly by the crude laws of causality that govern simpler places, writes himself as both author and artifact. Perhaps he fell into the cistern, perhaps he fell into the story of the cistern. Perhaps, in a city where the protocol has been running for centuries, the distinction ceased to matter long ago. He tucks the folio carefully into a drawer stamped with brass lettering. Asterisk, patient journals, J. Doe. Asterisk, the drawer closes with a sound like a card being played to the table. He rises. Somewhere above, in the waking city, dawn lays a pale coin on the tallest gargoyle's brow. And the hook that lingers, the question that perfumes the air like expensive cologne, or the first hint of gas escaping a cracked valve, is a whispering flip of a card. If stories make the city, which story will we choose to dream next? And so the wheel turns, my attentive companion of the dark hours, and Gotham breathes in and breathes out, drinking its own chaos and exhaling its rigid law in an eternal exchange. The night still prowls his rooftops, stern as scripture. The Jester still laughs his frequency into the bricks and bones, and the cistern older than both. Patient as stone holds its mercurial vintage and waits for the next soul who leans too close to the rim, drawn by symbols they mistake for accidents. You have heard the tale that the city keeps folded in her darkest pocket. You know now the origin that no one speaks, the alchemical truth that hides beneath the myth. Whether you choose to believe it or file it away as one more story in a city made of stories, well, that is your portion to carry. Let your breathing slow now. Let the tale sink into the silt at the bottom of your mind where dreams are made. The gargoyles are watching, as they always do. The wheel is turning, as it always has. And somewhere, in a vault, or on a rooftop, or in the space between waking and sleeping, someone is laughing at the cosmic jest of it all. Sleep now, wanderer. Let the city's lullaby carry you down. And should you dream of jesters and knights, of cisterns and carnivals, of a city that builds itself into the shape of a spell, well, that is only proof that the story has done its work. Until we meet again in the small hours, when the world grows thin and the truth slips through, good night.